Hi everyone out there. Today we're going to unravel two of the most interesting disasters of all time, Titanic and the Hindenburg, right now. Hi everyone, how are you today? I'm so glad. Remember, school's not out. We're still learning. Every day learn something new. I'm Mrs. Boyt, and today I want to give a shout out to Dublin for two things. First of all, he's one of my online students. He left this adorable shirt at my doorstep, and I really do appreciate it. Also, he gave me some great ideas for content in this video. He wanted to know about the Titanic and the Hindenburg, and this is a great opportunity to use one of the Common Core standards, which is to compare and contrast two events. And we're going to take these historical events and compare and contrast them. I would love to get content ideas. Please subscribe, click the bell on. I like to stay here with you guys as soon as I release a video so I can communicate with you as you're asking more questions. Today, we're going to talk about two things that happened in history. And they were both two very big disasters that have transcended time, and we still talk about them today. One was the Titanic. That was an event that happened actually in 1912. And the Hindenburg happened much later in 1937. The Titanic hit an iceberg, and that was really the initial cause of the disaster. Hindenburg, the simple fact that it crashed was it was a static electricity discharge from a storm that was happening, and there was a small leak in the balloon. The Titanic was a boat. It was called the unsinkable ship. It was actually owned by J.P. Morgan out of New York City. The Hindenburg was a big, huge balloon. It was actually owned by Germany. It was used as German propaganda. If you don't know what propaganda is, make sure you go watch the video on propaganda. They used this balloon as a propaganda tool, and as the Titanic was known as the unsinkable ship, the propaganda behind the Hindenburg, they called themselves the Knights of the Air, and they used their Nazi regime flag on the Hindenburg as a propaganda tool to sort of tout their power and their strength as a country. We know also this fact. The Titanic was on its first maiden voyage, whilst the Hindenburg, this was its 35th trip across the Atlantic. So we know both were crossing the Atlantic. We also know that the Titanic sunk, but other ships were built, and travel by ship is still a big thing today. People do still ride passages over the ocean, over the Atlantic, on cruise ships very frequently. However, the Hindenburg completely halted air travel in the balloon way. So we never saw another balloon carrying passengers after that, as far as air passengers who would pay for a ticket. How many passengers perished in each of these accidents? We know that there were 2,200 people on board the Titanic when it hit the iceberg. They only had enough lifeboats on board that ship for about half of the passengers. And they were not filling up the lifeboats to capacity because they canceled the lifeboat drill, and people really didn't know where to go, which lifeboat they were assigned to. We also know that when the Hindenburg went down, they had 97 people on board, and most of them survived. So how many survived on the Titanic? While only 700 people survived on the Titanic out of 2,200. That means 1,500 people perished. 62 people survived the Hindenburg, and that means the majority did live. Let's talk about some of the mistakes that were made with the Titanic and some of the mistakes that were made that caused the Hindenburg also to crash. This convergence of events that led to these disasters we can call causes and the effect. We've already established the effect. The Titanic sinks, the Hindenburg crashes. What were the events? What's the cause that led to that end result? Well, let's talk about the causes of the Titanic. The Titanic captain and the workers were ignoring the glacier warnings. There were a lot of glacier warnings that were being ignored, and they were saying, "Oh, it's fine." They put two guys up on deck to watch with their binoculars for glaciers, but as we know, they did spot it and they did inform, but it was just too little, too late. Let's talk about a cause of the Hindenburg. Listen, this thing was filled with hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas is explosive. You've heard of the hydrogen bomb. Why? They intended on filling this balloon with helium, but helium was outlawed, which was less explosive. The hydrogen is definitely more explosive, and it was filled with that. Let's talk about a cause of the Titanic. The captain wanted to impress the media, the press, by arriving in the harbor early to pump it up, get it going, full speed ahead, because he wanted to be in the harbor before the morning they were supposed to arrive. Even though the glacier warnings meant that that would be dangerous because they could hit a glacier going too fast. So they probably should have pulled back and slowed down the speed, but they sped up in order to impress people. Okay, let's not let our egos get away from us. In the same vein, let's talk about one of the causes of the Hindenburg disaster. There was inclement weather. There was a storm happening. And let's see, you have storm, you have electric discharge, you have an explosion. Let's talk about the engineering of this great unsinkable ship. It was engineered in such a way that there were compartments down underneath the hull. And if 4 of those compartments got pierced open and filled with water, the ship would still not sink. But as the ship was heading towards the iceberg, they made a sharp turn to try to avoid the iceberg. And that means, you know, that if the iceberg's this big on top, it's multiple times bigger on the bottom and sharp edges. And so that iceberg poked into the side of that ship in 6 compartments. That means 6 compartments filled up. So the engineer of the ship was on board that day, and he knew immediately that they were going to sink, and within the next 2 hours that they had to get as many people as they can to safety. And we know that engineer did also go down with the ship, with the captain as well, and most of the gentlemen on the ship went down with honor and grace. As far as the Hindenburg is concerned, we know that there was a storm, and we know there was an electric discharge, kind of like a static electricity. If you move your hands like this and you touch something and you get shocked, that's sort of what happened with this balloon. There was a small leak or tear, and that, along with the electric discharge or a little bit of lightning that comes out of the cloud, and it really made that explode. But there are some alternate theories, because there was a smoking room on board. A smoking room. Yes, cigars, cigarettes, people lighting up inside a hydrogen-filled balloon. Not a very good idea, science would tell us. What did it cost to take a journey on the Titanic? Well, we know that the third-class passengers paid a much smaller amount than the first-class passengers. So the third-class passengers, those are the ones that were kind of trapped and locked down below in not the swanky quarters. They paid starting at $150 for their tickets, which today, that ticket would cost $1,700. So still not a cheap amount even back then. And the first class passengers were paying $4,300, which is the equivalency of $50,000 today. That's a lot of money. Also, the ticket price of the Hindenburg at the time was $400, which was the price of a car back then. The price would today be $7,427. Again, very expensive. It put you up in an elite status if you could say that you bought travel on one of these really cool modes of transportation. Now, of the people that perished on the Titanic, it was 68% of people did not make it through that voyage. That's 68 out of every 100 people who bought passage on that trip. Well, not all bought passage. Some were actually crew members. And then of the Hindenburg, we know that 26 out of every 100 people perished. So 26% of the people did not live. 64% survived. Why? Why was the rate so much higher on the Hindenburg? The Titanic sunk in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The waters were freezing. The people who jumped off the ship into the water could not survive. We also know that the SS Californian ignored the SOS call. The Hindenburg was crash landing, and many people were able to jump out of the ship onto the ground, and they survived the falls because it was crash landing on land. Now, we know many of the people who jumped out of the ship were on fire, so they were burned badly. But again, many survived, much greater survival rate. And remember, there were much less passengers as well on the Hindenburg. One of the things that is interesting is the Titanic had a pretty good list of famous people who were on that ship that day, while the Hindenburg didn't really have any notable or famous people. Guggenheim was on the Titanic, the Guggenheim Museum. We know that Strauss was on the Titanic, and of course these two also perished with the ship. But Strauss owned Macy's and Company. Unsinkable Molly Brown is a famous person because she helped people get on the boats from out of the water that weren't quite filled up. Also, we know that Astor, one of the richest people around at the time, was also on the Titanic. But who wasn't on the Titanic? Did you know that Milton Hershey of Hershey's Chocolate actually bought passage on the Titanic, but didn't end up getting on board? For the Titanic, this was just a huge embarrassment for the captain of the ship, who, remember, made all those mistakes, increased the speed, made a sharp turn, ignoring the iceberg warnings. As far as the Hindenburg, we know that this crash was just a huge embarrassment to the Germans because they were touting how, masterful they were at their engineering skills and how they were knights of the air. There are your basic interesting facts about the Titanic versus the Hindenburg disasters. Teachers, parents, have your student make a Venn diagram with overlapping circles where they can put the Titanic differences versus the Hindenburg differences, and in the center, the similarities. Another thing we could do with this information is have cause and effect chart. That is a really great thing. You can compare and contrast these events in an essay. Depth and complexity icons. We can talk about the emblem of convergence and how the convergence of events led to the central event, which was, of course, the sinking of the ship or the crash of the Hindenburg balloon. Two events that have gone down in history as memorable, and I hope they're more memorable to you now. So I'll see you tomorrow on a new episode of Mrs. Boyt Live. Bye-bye.